Boys' Weeklies. You never walk far through any poor quarter in any big town without coming upon a small newsagent's shop. The general appearance of these shops is always very much the same. A few posters for the Daily Mail and the News of the World outside, a poky little window with sweet bottles and packets of players, and a dark interior smelling of licorice all sorts, and festooned from floor to ceiling with vilely printed twopenny papers, most of them with lurid cover illustrations in 3 colours. Except for the daily and evening papers, the stock of these shops hardly overlaps at all with that of the big newsagents. Their main selling line is the twopenny weekly, and the number and variety of these is almost unbelievable. Every hobby and pastime, cage birds, fretwork, carpentering, bees, carrier pigeons, home conjuring, philately, chess, has at least one paper devoted to it, and generally several. Gardening and livestock keeping must have at least a score between them. Then there are the sporting papers, the radio papers, the children's comics, the various snippet papers such as Titbits, the large range of papers devoted to the movies, and all more or less exploiting women's legs, the various trade papers, the women's story papers, the Oracle, Secrets, Pigs paper, etc., etc. The needlework papers, these so numerous that a display of them alone will often fill an entire window, and in addition the long series of Yank mags, fight stories, action stories, western short stories, etc., which are imported shop-soiled from America and sold at 2 pence halfpenny or 3 pence. And the periodical proper shades off into the 4-penny novelette, the Aldine boxing novels, the boy's friend library, the schoolgirl's own library, and many others. Probably the contents of these shops is the best available indication of what the mass of English people really feels and thinks. Certainly, nothing half so revealing exists in documentary form. Bestseller novels, for instance, tell one a great deal, but the novel is aimed almost exclusively at people above the £4 a week level. The movies are probably a very unsafe guide to popular taste, because the film industry is virtually a monopoly, which means that it is not obliged to study its public at all closely. The same applies to some extent to the daily papers, and most of all to the radio. But it does not apply to the weekly paper with a smallish circulation and specialized subject matter. Papers like Exchange and Mart, for instance, or Cage Birds, or The Oracle, or Prediction, or The Matrimonial Times, only exist because there is a definite demand for them, and they reflect the minds of their readers as a great national daily with a circulation of millions cannot possibly do. Here, I am only dealing with a single series of papers, the boys' twopenny weeklies, often inaccurately described as penny dreadfuls. Falling strictly within this class, there are at present 10 papers: The Gem, Magnet, Modern Boy, Triumph, and Champion, all owned by the Amalgamated Press, and The Wizard, Rover, Skipper, Hotspur, and Adventure, all owned by D.C. Thompson and Co. What the circulations of these papers are, I do not know. The editors and proprietors refuse to name any figures, and in any case, the circulation of a paper carrying serial stories is bound to fluctuate widely. But there is no question that the combined public of the 10 papers is a very large one. They are on sale in every town in England, and nearly every boy who reads at all goes through a phase of reading one or more of them. The Gem and Magnet, which are much the oldest of these papers, are of rather different type from the rest, and they have evidently lost some of their popularity during the past few years. A good many boys now regard them as old-fashioned and slow. Nevertheless, I want to discuss them first, because they are more interesting psychologically than the others, and also because the mere survival of such papers into the 1930s is a rather startling phenomenon. The Gem and Magnet are sister papers. Characters out of one paper frequently appear in the other, and were both started more than 30 years ago. At that time, together with Chums and the old BOP, they were the leading paper for boys, and they remained dominant till quite recently. Each of them carries every week a 15 or 20,000 word school story, complete in itself, but usually more or less connected with the story of the week before. The Gem, in addition to its school story, carries one or more adventure serials. Otherwise, the two papers are so much alike that they can be treated as one, though the Magnet has always been the better known of the two, probably because it possesses a really first-rate character in the fat boy, Billy Bunta. The stories are stories of what purports to be public school life, and the schools, Greyfriars in the Magnet and St. Jim's in the Gem, are represented as ancient and fashionable foundations of the type of Eton or Winchester. All the leading characters are fourth-form boys aged 14 or 15, older or younger boys only appearing in very minor parts. Like Sexton Blake and Nelson Lee, these boys continue week after week and year after year, never getting any older. Very occasionally, a new boy arrives or a minor character drops out, but in at any rate the last 25 years, the personnel has barely altered. All the principal characters in both papers, Bob Cherry, Tom Merry, Harry Wharton, Johnny Bull, Billy Bunter, and the rest of them, were at Greyfriars or St. Jim's long before the Great War, exactly the same age as at present, having much the same kind of adventures and talking almost exactly the same dialect. And not only the characters, but the whole atmosphere of both Gem and Magnet has been preserved unchanged, partly by means of very elaborate stylization. The stories in the Magnet are signed Frank Richards, and those in the Gem, Martin Clifford, but a series lasting 30 years could hardly be the work of the same person every week. Consequently, they have to be written in a style that is easily imitated, an extraordinary, artificial, repetitive style, quite different from anything now existing in English literature. A couple of extracts will do as illustrations. Here is one from the Magnet. Groan. Shut up, Bunta. Groan. Shutting up was not really in Billy Bunter's line. He seldom shut up, though often requested to do so. On the present awful occasion, the fat owl of Greyfriars was less inclined than ever to shut up. And he did not shut up. He groaned, and went on groaning. Even groaning did not fully express Bunter's feelings. His feelings, in fact, were inexpressible. There were 6 of them in the soup. Only one of the 6 uttered sounds of woe and lamentation. But that one, William George Bunta, uttered enough for the whole party, and a little over. Harry Wharton and co. stood in a wrathy and worried group. They were landed and stranded, diddled, dished, and done, etc., etc., etc. Here is one from the gem. Oh, kawums! Oh, gum! Ooh! Arthur Augustus sat up dizzily. He grabbed his handkerchief and pressed it to his damaged nose. Tom Merry sat up, gasping for breath. They looked at one another. By Jove! This is a go, dear boy, gurgled Arthur Augustus. I have been thrown into quite a flutter. Ooh, the waters, the ruffians, the fearful outsiders. Wow, etc., etc., etc. Both of these extracts are entirely typical. You would find something like them in almost every chapter of every number, today or 25 years ago. The first thing that anyone would notice is the extraordinary amount of tautology. The first of these 2 passages contains 125 words and could be compressed into about 30, seemingly designed to spin out the story, but actually playing its part in creating the atmosphere. For the same reason, various facetious expressions are repeated over and over again. Wrathy, for instance, is a great favourite, and so is diddled, dished, and done. Ooh, grew, and yaroo, stylized cries of pain, recur constantly, and so does ha, 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 always given a line to itself, so that sometimes a quarter of a column or thereabouts consists of ha, ha, ha. The slang, go and eat coke, what the thump, you frabjous ass, etc., etc., has never been altered, so that the boys are now using slang which is at least 30 years out of date. In addition, the various nicknames are rubbed in on every possible occasion. Every few lines we are reminded that Harry Wharton and co. are the famous 5. Bunta is always the fat owl, or the owl of the remove. Vernon Smith is always the bounder of Greyfriars. Gussie, the Honourable Arthur Augustus Darcy, is always the swell of St. Jim's, and so on and so forth. There is a constant, untiring effort to keep the atmosphere intact and to make sure that every new reader learns immediately who is who. The result has been to make Greyfriars and St. Jim's into an extraordinary little world of their own, a world which cannot be taken seriously by anyone over 15, but which, at any rate, is not easily forgotten. By a debasement of the Dickens technique, a series of stereotyped characters has been built up, in several cases very successfully. Billy Bunta, for instance, must be one of the best-known figures in English fiction. For the mere number of people who know him, he ranks with Sexton Blake, Tarzan, Sherlock Holmes, and a handful of characters in Dickens. Needless to say, these stories are fantastically unlike life at a real public school. They run in cycles of rather differing types, but in general, they are the clean fun, knockabout type of story, with the interest centering round horseplay, practical jokes, ragging masters, fights, canings, football, cricket, and food. A constantly recurring story is one in which a boy is accused of some misdeed committed by another and is too much of a sportsman to reveal the truth. The good boys are good in the clean living Englishman tradition. They keep in hard training, wash behind their ears, never hit below the belt, etc., etc. And, by way of contrast, there is a series of bad boys, Rack, Crook, Loader, and others, whose badness consists in betting, smoking cigarettes, and frequenting public houses. All these boys are constantly on the verge of expulsion, but, as it would mean a change of personnel if any boy were actually expelled, no one is ever caught out in any really serious offense. Stealing, for instance, barely enters as a motif. Sex is completely taboo, especially in the form in which it actually arises at public schools. Occasionally, girls enter into the stories, and, very rarely, there is something approaching a mild flirtation, but it is always entirely in the spirit of clean fun. A boy and a girl enjoy going for bicycle rides together. That is all it ever amounts to. Kissing, for instance, would be regarded as soppy. Even the bad boys are presumed to be completely sexless. When the Gem and Magnet were started, it is probable that there was a deliberate intention to get away from the guilty, sex-ridden atmosphere that pervaded so much of the early literature for boys. In the 90s, the boys' own paper, for instance, used to have its correspondence columns full of terrifying warnings against masturbation, and books like St. Winifred's and Tom Brown's School Days were heavy with homosexual feeling, though, no doubt, the authors were not fully aware of it. In The Gem and Magnet, sex simply does not exist as a problem. Religion is also taboo. In the whole 30 years issue of the two papers, the word God probably does not occur, except in God Save the King. On the other hand, there has always been a very strong temperance strain. Drinking and, by association, smoking are regarded as rather disgraceful even in an adult. Shady is the usual word, but at the same time as something irresistibly fascinating, a sort of substitute for sex. In their moral atmosphere, the Gem and Magnet have a great deal in common with the Boy Scout movement, which started at about the same time. All literature of this kind is partly plagiarism. Sexton Blake, for instance, started off, quite frankly, as an imitation of Sherlock Holmes, and still resembles him fairly strongly. He has hawk-like features, lives in Baker Street, smokes enormously, and puts on a dressing gown when he wants to think. The Gem and Magnet probably owe something to the school story writers who were flourishing when they began, Gunby Hadath, Desmond Coke, and the rest, but they owe more to 19th century models. Insofar as Greyfriars and St. Jim's are like real schools at all, they are much more like Tom Brown's Rugby than a modern public school. Neither school has an OTC, for instance. Games are not compulsory, and the boys are even allowed to wear what clothes they like. But without doubt, the main origin of these papers is Storky and Co. This book has had an immense influence on boys' literature, and it is one of those books which have a sort of traditional reputation among people who have never even seen a copy of it. More than once in boys' weekly papers, I have come across a reference to Storky and Co., in which the word was spelt Storky. Even the name of the chief comic among the Greyfriars Masters, Mr. Prout, is taken from Stalky and Co., and so is much of the slang. Jape, merry, giddy, bisney, business, frabjuice, don't or doesn't, all of them out of date even when Gem and Magnet started. There are also traces of earlier origins. The name Greyfriars is probably taken from Thackeray, and Gosling, the school porter in the Magnet, talks in an imitation of Dickens's dialect. With all this, the supposed glamour of public school life is played for all it is worth. There is all the usual paraphernalia: lock-up, roll call, house matches, fagging, prefects, cosy teas round the sturdy fire, etc., etc., and constant reference to the old school, the old grey stones. Both schools were founded in the early 16th century. The team spirit of the Greyfriars men. As for the snob appeal, it is completely shameless. Each school has a titled boy or two whose titles are constantly thrust in the reader's face. Other boys have the names of well-known aristocratic families: Talbot, Manners, Lowther. We are forever being reminded that Gussie is the Honourable Arthur A. Darcy, son of Lord Eastwood, that Jack Blake is heir to Broad Acres, that Hari Jamset Ram Singh, nicknamed Inky, is the nabob of Bunnypur, that Vernon Smith's father is a millionaire. Till recently, the illustrations in both papers always depicted the boys in clothes imitated from those of Eton. In the last few years, Greyfriars has changed over to blazers and flannel trousers, but St. Jim's still sticks to the Eton jacket, and Gussie sticks to his top hat. In the school magazine, which appears every week as part of the Magnet, Harry Wharton writes an article discussing the pocket money received by the fellows in the Remove, and reveals that some of them get as much as £5 a week. This kind of thing is a perfectly deliberate incitement to wealth fantasy. And here it is worth noticing a rather curious fact, and that is that the school story is a thing peculiar to England. So far as I know, there are extremely few school stories in foreign languages. The reason, obviously, is that in England, education is mainly a matter of status. The most definite dividing line between the petite bourgeoisie and the working class is that the former pay for their education, and within the bourgeoisie there is another unbridgeable gulf between the public school and the private school. It is quite clear that there are tens and scores of thousands of people to whom every detail of life at a posh public school is wildly thrilling and romantic. They happen to be outside that mystic world of quadrangles and house colours, but they yearn after it, daydream about it, live mentally in it for hours at a stretch. The question is, who are these people? Who reads the Gem and Magnet? Obviously, one can never be quite certain about this kind of thing. All I can say from my own observation is this. Boys who are likely to go to public schools themselves generally read the Gem and Magnet, but they nearly always stop reading them when they are about 12. They may continue for another year from force of habit, but by that time they have ceased to take them seriously. On the other hand, the boys at very cheap private schools, the schools that are designed for people who can't afford a public school but consider the council schools common, continue reading the Gem and Magnet for several years longer. A few years ago, I was a teacher at 2 of these schools myself. I found that not only did virtually all the boys read The Gem and Magnet, but that they were still taking them fairly seriously when they were 15 or even 16. These boys were the sons of shopkeepers, office employees, and small business and professional men, and obviously it is this class that The Gem and Magnet are aimed at. But they are certainly read by working-class boys as well. They are generally on sale in the poorest quarters of big towns, and I have known them to be read by boys whom one might expect to be completely immune from public school glamour. I have seen a young coal miner, for instance, a lad who had already worked a year or 2 underground, eagerly reading The Gem. Recently, I offered a batch of English papers to some British legionnaires of the French Foreign Legion in North Africa. They picked out The Gem and Magnet first. Both papers are much read by girls, and the pen pals department of The Gem shows that it is read in every corner of the British Empire by Australians, Canadians, Palestine Jews, Malays, Arabs, Straits Chinese, etc., etc. The editors evidently expect their readers to be aged round about 14, and the advertisements, milk chocolate, postage stamps, water pistols, blushing cured, home conjuring tricks, itching powder, the fine fun ring, which runs a needle into your friend's hand, etc., etc., indicate roughly the same age. There are also the Admiralty advertisements, however, which call for youths between 17 and 22. And there is no question that these papers are also read by adults. It is quite common for people to write to the editor and say that they have read every number of The Gem or Magnet for the past 30 years. Here, for instance, is a letter from a lady in Salisbury. I can say of your splendid yarns of Harry Wharton and Co., of Greyfriars, that they never fail to reach a high standard. Without doubt, they are the finest stories of their type on the market today, which is saying a good deal. They seem to bring you face to face with nature. I have taken the Magnet from the start, and have followed the adventures of Harry Wharton and Co. with rapt interest. I have no sons, but 2 daughters, and there's always a rush to be the first to read the grand old paper. My husband, too, was a staunch reader of the Magnet, until he was suddenly taken away from us. It is well worth getting hold of some copies of The Gem and Magnet, especially The Gem, simply to have a look at the correspondence columns. What is truly startling is the intense interest with which the pettiest details of life at Greyfriars and St. Jim's are followed up. Here, for instance, are a few of the questions sent in by readers. What age is Dick Roylance? How old is St. Jim's? Can you give me a list of the shell and their studies? How much did Darcy's monocle cost? How is it fellows like Crook are in the shell, and decent fellows like yourself are only in the 4th? What are the form captain's 3 chief duties? Who is the chemistry master at St. Jim's? From a girl. Where is St. Jim's situated? Could you tell me how to get there, as I would love to see the building? Are you boys just phonies, as I think you are? It is clear that many of the boys and girls who write these letters are living a complete fantasy life. Sometimes a boy will write, for instance, giving his age, height, weight, chest, and bicep measurements, and asking which member of the shell or 4th form he most exactly resembles. The demand for a list of the studies on the shell passage, with an exact account of who lives in each, is a very common one. The editors, of course, do everything in their power to keep up the illusion. In the gem, Jake Black is supposed to write the answers to correspondence, and in the magnet, a couple of pages is always given up to the school magazine, The Greyfriars Herald, edited by Harry Wharton. And there is another page in which one or other character is written up each week. The stories run in cycles, 2 or 3 characters being kept in the foreground for several weeks at a time. First, there will be a series of rollicking adventure stories, featuring the famous Five and Billy Bunta. Then a run of stories turning on mistaken identity, with Wibbly, the makeup wizard, in the star part. Then a run of more serious stories, in which Vernon Smith is trembling on the verge of expulsion. And here, one comes upon the real secret of the gem and magnet, and the probable reason why they continue to be read, in spite of their obvious out-of-dateness. It is that the characters are so carefully graded as to give almost every type of reader a character he can identify himself with. Most boys' papers aim at doing this, hence the boy assistant, Sexton Blake's tinker, Nelson Lee's nipper, etc., who usually accompanies the explorer, detective, or whatnot on his adventures. But in these cases, there is only one boy, and usually it is much the same type of boy. In the gem and magnet, there is a model for nearly everybody. There is the normal, athletic, high-spirited boy, Tom Merry, Jack Blake, Frank Nugent. A slightly rowdier version of this type, Bob Cherry. A more aristocratic version, Talbot Manners. A quieter, more serious version, Harry Wharton. And a stolid, bulldog version, Johnny Bull. Then there is the reckless, daredevil type of boy, Vernon Smith. The definitely clever, studious boy, Mark Linley, Dick Penfold. And the eccentric boy, who is not good at games, but possesses some special talent, Skinner, Wibbly. And there is the scholarship boy, Tom Redwing, an important figure in this class of story because he makes it possible for boys from very poor homes to project themselves into the public school atmosphere. In addition, there are Australian, Irish, Welsh, Manx, Yorkshire, and Lancashire boys to play upon local patriotism. But the subtlety of characterization goes deeper than this. If one studies the correspondence columns, one sees that there is probably no character in the gem and magnet whom some or other reader does not identify with, except the out-and-out comics, Coca, Billy Bunta, Fisher T. Price, the money-grubbing American boy, and, of course, the Masters. Bunta, though in his origin he probably owed something to the fat boy in Pickwick, is a real creation. His tight trousers, against which boots and canes are constantly thudding, his astuteness in search of food, his postal order which never turns up, have made him famous wherever the Union Jack waves. But he is not a subject for daydreams. On the other hand, another seeming figure of fun, Gussie, the Honourable Arthur A. Darcy, the swell of St. Jim's, is evidently much admired. Like everything else in the gem and magnet, Gussie is at least 30 years out of date. He is the Knut of the early 20th century, or even the Masher of the 90s. By Jove, dear boy, and really, I shall be obliged to give you a fearful thrashing. The monocled idiot who made good on the fields of Mons and Le Cateau. And his evident popularity goes to show how deep the snob appeal of this type is. English people are extremely fond of the titled ass, cf. Lord Peter Wimsey, who always turns up trumps in the moment of emergency. Here is a letter from one of Gussie's girl admirers. I think you're too hard on Gussie. I wonder he's still in existence, the way you treat him. He's my hero. Did you know I write lyrics? How's this? To the tune of Goody Goody. Gonna get my gas mask. Join the ARP. 'Cause I'm wise to all those bombs you drop on me. Gonna dig myself a trench. Inside the garden fence. Gonna seal my windows up with tin. So that the tear gas can't get in. Gonna park my cannon right outside the curb. With a note to Adolf Hitler. Don't disturb. And if I never fall in Nazi hands, that's soon enough for me. Gonna get my gas mask, join the ARP. P.S. Do you get on well with girls? I quote this in full because, dated April 1939, it is interesting as being probably the earliest mention of Hitler in the gem. In the gem, there is also a heroic fat boy, Fatty Wynne, as a set-off against Bunta. Vernon Smith, the bounder of the remove, a Byronic character, always on the verge of the sack, is another great favourite. And even some of the cads probably have their following. Loda, for instance, the rotter of the 6th, is a cad, but he is also a highbrow and given to saying sarcastic things about football and the team spirit. The boys of the remove only think him all the more of a cad for this, but a certain type of boy would probably identify with him. Even Rack, Crook and Co. are probably admired by small boys who think it diabolically wicked to smoke cigarettes. A frequent question in the correspondence column: what brand of cigarettes does Rack smoke? Naturally, the politics of the gem and magnet are conservative, but in a completely pre-1914 style, with no fascist tinge. In reality, their basic political assumptions are two: nothing ever changes, and foreigners are funny. In the gem of 1939, Frenchmen are still froggies, and Italians are still dagos. Mossou, the French master at Greyfriars, is the usual comic paper frog, with pointed beard, peg-top trousers, etc. Inky, the Indian boy, though a Raja, and therefore possessing snob appeal, is also the comic babu of the Punch tradition. The relfulness is not the proper caper, my esteemed Bob, said Inky. Let dogs delight in the barkfulness and bitefulness, but the soft answer is the cracked pitcher that goes longest to a bird in the bush, as the English proverb remarks. Fisher T. Fish is the old-style stage Yankee. Well, I guess, etc., dating from a period of Anglo-American jealousy. Wun Lung, the Chinese boy, he has rather faded out of late, no doubt because some of the magnet's readers are straight Chinese, is the 19th century pantomime Chinaman, with saucer-shaped hat, pigtail, and pidgin English. The assumption all along is not only that foreigners are comics who are put there for us to laugh at, but that they can be classified in much the same way as insects. That is why, in all boys' papers, not only the gem and magnet, a Chinese is invariably portrayed with a pigtail. It is the thing you recognize him by, like the Frenchman's beard or the Italian's barrel organ. In papers of this kind, it occasionally happens that when the setting of a story is in a foreign country, some attempt is made to describe the natives as individual human beings, but, as a rule, it is assumed that foreigners of any one race are all alike and will conform more or less exactly to the following patterns. Frenchman, excitable, wears beard, gesticulates wildly. Spaniard, Mexican, etc., sinister, treacherous. Arab, Afghan, etc., sinister, treacherous. Chinese, sinister, treacherous, wears pigtail. Italian, excitable, grinds barrel organ or carries stiletto. Swede, Dane, etc., kind-hearted, stupid. Negro, comic, very faithful. The working classes only enter into the gem and magnet as comics or semi-villains, racecourse touts, etc. As for class friction, trade unionism, strikes, slumps, unemployment, fascism, and civil war, not a mention. Somewhere or other in the 30 years issue of the two papers, you might perhaps find the word socialism, but you have to look a long time for it. If the Russian Revolution is anywhere referred to, it will be indirectly in the word bolshoi, meaning a person of violent, disagreeable habits. Hitler and the Nazis are just beginning to make their appearance in the sort of reference I quoted above. The war crisis of September 1938 made just enough impression to produce a story in which Mr. Vernon Smith, the Bounder's millionaire father, cashed in on the general panic by buying up country houses in order to sell them to crisis scuttlers. But that is probably as near to noticing the European situation as the gem and magnet will come, until the war actually starts. That does not mean that these papers are unpatriotic. Quite the contrary. Throughout the Great War, the gem and magnet were perhaps the most consistently and cheerfully patriotic papers in England. Almost every week, the boys caught a spy or pushed a conchi into the army. And during the rationing period, Eat Less Bread was printed in large type on every page. But their patriotism has nothing whatever to do with power politics or ideological warfare. It is more akin to family loyalty, and actually it gives one a valuable clue to the attitude of ordinary people, especially the huge untouched block of the middle class and the better-off working class. These people are patriotic to the middle of their bones, but they do not feel that what happens in foreign countries is any of their business. When England is in danger, they rally to its defense as a matter of course, but in between times, they are not interested. After all, England is always in the right, and England always wins, so why worry? It is an attitude that has been shaken during the past 20 years, but not so deeply as is sometimes supposed. Failure to understand it is one of the reasons why left-wing political parties are seldom able to produce an acceptable foreign policy. The mental world of the gem and magnet, therefore, is something like this. The year is 1910, or 1940, but it is all the same. You are at Greyfriars, a rosy-cheeked boy of 14 in posh tailor-made clothes, sitting down to tea in your study on the removed passage after an exciting game of football, which was won by an odd goal in the last half-minute. There is a cozy fire in the study, and outside the wind is whistling. The ivy clusters thickly round the old grey stones. The king is on his throne, and the pound is worth a pound. Over in Europe, the comic foreigners are jabbering and gesticulating, but the grim grey battleships of the British fleet are steaming up the channel, and at the outposts of empire, the monocled Englishmen are holding the niggers at bay. Lord Mauleverer has just got another fiver, and we are all settling down to a tremendous tea of sausages, sardines, crumpets, potted meat, jam, and donuts. After tea, we shall sit round the study fire, having a good laugh at Billy Bunta, and discussing the team for next week's match against Rookwood. Everything is safe, solid, and unquestionable. Everything will be the same forever and ever. That, approximately, is the atmosphere. But now turn from the Gem and Magnet to the more up-to-date papers which have appeared since the Great War. The truly significant thing is that they have more points of resemblance to the Gem and Magnet than points of difference. But it is better to consider the differences first. There are 8 of these newer papers: The Modern Boy, Triumph, Champion, Wizard, Rover, Skipper, Hotspur, and Adventure. All of these have appeared since the Great War, but, except for The Modern Boy, none of them is less than 5 years old. 2 papers which ought also to be mentioned briefly here, though they are not strictly in the same class as the rest, are the Detective Weekly and the Thriller, both owned by the Amalgamated Press. The Detective Weekly has taken over Sexton Blake. Both of these papers admit a certain amount of sex interest into their stories, and though certainly read by boys, they are not aimed at them exclusively. All the others are boys' papers, pure and simple, and they are sufficiently alike to be considered together. There does not seem to be any notable difference between Thompson's publications and those of the Amalgamated Press. As soon as one looks at these papers, one sees their technical superiority to the Gem and Magnet. To begin with, they have the great advantage of not being written entirely by one person. Instead of one long, complete story, a number of the Wizard or Hotspur consists of half a dozen or more serials, none of which goes on forever. Consequently, there is far more variety and far less padding, and none of the tiresome stylization and facetiousness of the Gem and Magnet. Look at these 2 extracts. For example, Billy Bunta groaned. A quarter of an hour had elapsed out of the 2 hours that Bunta was booked for extra French. In a quarter of an hour, there were only 15 minutes. But every one of those minutes seemed inordinately long to Bunta. They seemed to crawl by like tired snails. Looking at the clock in classroom number 10, the fat owl could hardly believe that only 15 minutes had passed. It seemed more like 15 hours, if not 15 days. Other fellows were in extra French as well as Bunta. They did not matter. Bunta did. Magnet. After a terrible climb, hacking out handholds in the smooth ice every step of the way up, Sergeant Lionheart Logan of the Mounties was now clinging like a human fly to the face of an icy cliff, as smooth and treacherous as a giant pane of glass. An Arctic blizzard, in all its fury, was buffeting his body, driving the blinding snow into his face, seeking to tear his fingers loose from their handholds and dash him to death on the jagged boulders which lay at the foot of the cliff 100 feet below. Crouching among those boulders were 11 villainous trappers who had done their best to shoot down Lionheart and his companion, Constable Jim Rogers, until the blizzard had blotted out the two Mounties out of sight from below. Wizard. The second extract gets you some distance with the story. The first takes 100 words to tell you that Bunta is in the detention class. Moreover, by not concentrating on school stories, in point of numbers, the school story slightly predominates in all these papers, except the thriller and detective weekly. The Wizard, Hotspur, etc. have far greater opportunities for sensationalism. Merely looking at the cover illustrations of the papers which I have on the table in front of me, here are some of the things I see. On one, a cowboy is clinging by his toes to the wing of an aeroplane in mid-air and shooting down another aeroplane with his revolver. On another, a Chinese is swimming for his life down a sewer with a swarm of ravenous-looking rats swimming after him. On another, an engineer is lighting a stick of dynamite, while a steel robot feels for him with its claws. On another, a man in airman's costume is fighting bare-handed against a rat somewhat larger than a donkey. On another, a nearly naked man of terrific muscular development had just seized a lion by the tail and flung it 30 yards over the wall of an arena, with the words, "Take back your blooming lion." Clearly, no school story can compete with this kind of thing. From time to time, the school buildings may catch fire, or the French master may turn out to be the head of an international anarchist gang, but in a general way, the interest must centre round cricket, school rivalries, practical jokes, etc. There is not much room for bombs, death rays, submachine guns, aeroplanes, mustangs, octopuses, grizzly bears, or gangsters. Examination of a large number of these papers shows that, putting aside school stories, the favorite subjects are Wild West, Frozen North, Foreign Legion, crime, always from the detective's angle, the Great War, Air Force or Secret Service, not the infantry, the Tarzan motif in varying forms, professional football, tropical exploration, historical romance, Robin Hood, Cavaliers and Roundheads, etc., and scientific invention. The Wild West still leads, at any rate as a setting, though the Red Indian seems to be fading out. The one theme that is really new is the scientific one. Death rays, Martians, invisible men, robots, helicopters, and interplanetary rockets figure largely. Here and there are even far-off rumors of psychotherapy and ductless glands. Whereas the gem and magnet derive from Dickens and Kipling, the Wizard, Champion, Modern Boy, etc., owe a great deal to H.G. Wells, who, rather than Jules Verne, is the father of science-fiction. Naturally, it is the magical, Martian aspect of science that is most exploited, but one or two papers include serious articles on scientific subjects, besides quantities of informative snippets. Examples: a kauri tree in Queensland, Australia, is over 12,000 years old. Nearly 50,000 thunderstorms occur every day. Helium gas costs 1 GB/pound per 1,000 cubic feet. There are over 500 varieties of spiders in Great Britain. London firemen use 14 million gallons of water annually, etc., etc. There is a marked advance in intellectual curiosity and, on the whole, in the demand made on the reader's attention. In practice, the Gem and Magnet and the post-war papers are read by much the same public, but the mental age aimed at seems to have risen by a year or 2 years an improvement probably corresponding to the improvement in elementary education since 1909. The other thing that has emerged in the post-war boys' papers, though not to anything like the extent one would expect, is bully worship and the cult of violence. If one compares the gem and magnet with a genuinely modern paper, the thing that immediately strikes one is the absence of the leader principle. There is no central dominating character. Instead, there are 15 or 20 characters, all more or less on an equality, with whom readers of different types can identify. In the more modern papers, this is not usually the case. Instead of identifying with a schoolboy of more or less his own age, the reader of The Skipper, Hotspur, etc. is led to identify with a G-man, with a foreign legionary, with some variant of Tarzan, with an air ace, a master spy, an explorer, a pugilist, at any rate, with some single all-powerful character who dominates everyone about him, and whose usual method of solving any problem is a sock on the jaw. This character is intended as a Superman, and as physical strength is the form of power that boys can best understand, he is usually a sort of human gorilla. In the Tarzan type of story, he is sometimes actually a giant, 8 or 10 feet high. At the same time, the scenes of violence in nearly all these stories are remarkably harmless and unconvincing. There is a great difference in tone between even the most bloodthirsty English paper and the threepenny Yank mags, fight stories, action stories, etc. Not strictly boys' papers, but largely read by boys. In the Yank mags, you get real bloodlust, really gory descriptions of the all-in, jump on his testicles style of fighting, written in a jargon that has been perfected by people who brood endlessly on violence. A paper like Fight Stories, for instance, would have very little appeal except to sadists and masochists. You can see the comparative gentleness of the English civilization by the amateurish way in which prize fighting is always described in the boys' weeklies. There is no specialized vocabulary. Look at these 4 extracts, 2 English, 2 American. When the gong sounded, both men were breathing heavily, and each had great red marks on his chest. Bill's chin was bleeding, and Ben had a cut over his right eye. Into the corners they sank, but when the gong clanged again, they were up swiftly, and they went like tigers at each other. Rover. He walked in stolidly and smashed a club-like right to my face. Blood spattered, and I went back on my heels, but surged in and ripped my right under the heart. Another right smashed full on Sven's already battered mouth, and, spitting out the fragments of a tooth, he crashed a flailing left to my body. Fight Stories. It was amazing to watch the Black Panther at work. His muscles rippled and slid under his dark skin. There was all the power and grace of a giant cat in his swift and terrible onslaught. He volleyed blows with a bewildering speed for so huge a fellow. In a moment, Ben was simply blocking with his gloves as well as he could. Ben was really a past master of defense. He had many fine victories behind him. But the Negro's rights and lefts crashed through openings that hardly any other fighter could have found. Wizard. Haymakers which packed the bludgeoning weight of forest monarchs crashing down under the axe, hurled into the bodies of the 2 heavies as they swapped punches. Fight Stories. Notice how much more knowledgeable the American extracts sound. They are written for devotees of the prize ring. The others are not. Also, it ought to be emphasized that, on its level, the moral code of the English boys' papers is a decent one. Crime and dishonesty are never held up to admiration. There is none of the cynicism and corruption of the American gangster story. The huge sale of the Yank mags in England shows that there is a demand for that kind of thing, but very few English writers seem able to produce it. When hatred of Hitler became a major emotion in America, it was interesting to see how promptly anti-fascism was adapted to pornographic purposes by the editors of the Yank mags. One magazine which I have in front of me is given up to a long, complete story, When Hell Came to America, in which the agents of a blood-maddened European dictator are trying to conquer the USA with death rays and invisible aeroplanes. There is the frankest appeal to sadism, scenes in which the Nazis tie bombs to women's backs and fling them off heights to watch them blown to pieces in mid-air, others in which they tie naked girls together by their hair and prod them with knives to make them dance, etc., etc. The editor comments solemnly on all this, and uses it as a plea for tightening up restrictions against immigrants. On another page of the same paper, Lives of the Hotcha Chorus Girls reveals all the intimate secrets and fascinating pastimes of the famous Broadway Hotcha girls. Nothing is omitted. Price 10 cents. How to Love, 10 cents. French photo ring, 25 cents. Naughty Nudies transfers. From the outside of the glass, you see a beautiful girl, innocently dressed. Turn it around and look through the glass and, oh, what a difference. Set of 3 transfers, 25 cents, etc., etc., etc. There is nothing at all like this in any English paper likely to be read by boys. But the process of Americanization is going on all the same. The American ideal, the he-man, the tough guy, the gorilla who puts everything right by socking everybody else on the jaw, now figures in probably a majority of boys' papers. In one serial now running in the Skipper, he is always portrayed, ominously enough, swinging a rubber truncheon. The development of the Wizard, Hotspur, etc., as against the earlier boys' papers, boils down to this: better technique, more scientific interest, more bloodshed, more leader worship. But, after all, it is the lack of development that is the really striking thing. To begin with, there is no political development whatever. The world of the Skipper and the Champion is still the pre-1914 world of the Magnet and the Gem. The Wild West story, for instance, with its cattle rustlers, lynch law, and other paraphernalia belonging to the 80s, is a curiously archaic thing. It is worth noticing that in papers of this type, it is always taken for granted that adventures only happen at the ends of the earth, in tropical forests, in Arctic wastes, in African deserts, on western prairies, in Chinese opium dens, everywhere, in fact, except the places where things really do happen. That is a belief dating from 30 or 40 years ago, when the new continents were in process of being opened up. Nowadays, of course, if you really want adventure, the place to look for it is in Europe. But apart from the picturesque side of the Great War, contemporary history is carefully excluded. And, except that Americans are now admired instead of being laughed at, foreigners are exactly the same figures of fun that they always were. If a Chinese character appears, he is still the sinister pig-tailed opium smuggler of Saxe Roma. No indication that things have been happening in China since 1912. No indication that a war is going on there, for instance. If a Spaniard appears, he is still a dago or greaser who rolls cigarettes and stabs people in the back. No indication that things have been happening in Spain. Hitler and the Nazis have not yet appeared, or are barely making their appearance. There will be plenty about them in a little while, but it will be from a strictly patriotic angle, Britain versus Germany, with the real meaning of the struggle kept out of sight as much as possible. As for the Russian Revolution, it is extremely difficult to find any reference to it in any of these papers. When Russia is mentioned at all, it is usually in an information snippet. Example: there are 29,000 centenarians in the USSR, and any reference to the revolution is indirect and 20 years out of date. In one story in The Rover, for instance, somebody has a tame bear, and as it is a Russian bear, it is nicknamed Trotsky, obviously an echo of the 1917 through 23 period, and not of recent controversies. The clock has stopped at 1910. Britannia rules the waves, and no one has heard of slumps, booms, unemployment, dictatorships, purges, or concentration camps. And in social outlook, there is hardly any advance. The snobbishness is somewhat less open than in the Gem and Magnet, but that is the most one can possibly say. To begin with, the school story, always partly dependent on snob appeal, is by no means eliminated. Every number of a boys' paper includes at least one school story, these stories slightly outnumbering the Wild Westerns. The very elaborate fantasy life of the Gem and Magnet is not imitated, and there is more emphasis on extraneous adventure, but the social atmosphere, old grey stones, is much the same. When a new school is introduced at the beginning of a story, we are often told in just those words that it was a very posh school. From time to time, a story appears which is ostensibly directed against snobbery. The scholarship boy, C.F. Tom Redwing in The Magnet, makes fairly frequent appearances, and what is essentially the same theme is sometimes presented in this form. There is a great rivalry between two schools, one of which considers itself more posh than the other, and there are fights, practical jokes, football matches, etc., always ending in the discomfiture of the snobs. If one glances very superficially at some of these stories, it is possible to imagine that a democratic spirit has crept into the boys' weeklies, but when one looks more closely, one sees that they merely reflect the bitter jealousies that exist within the white-collar class. Their real function is to allow the boy who goes to a cheap private school, not a council school, to feel that his school is just as posh in the sight of God as Winchester or Eton. The sentiment of school loyalty, we're better than the fellows down the road, a thing almost unknown to the real working class, is still kept up. As these stories are written by many different hands, they do, of course, vary a great deal in tone. Some are reasonably free from snobbishness. In others, money and pedigree are exploited even more shamelessly than in the Gem and Magnet. In one that I came across, an actual majority of the boys mentioned were titled. Where working-class characters appear, it is usually either as comics, jokes about tramps, convicts, etc., or as prize fighters, acrobats, cowboys, professional footballers, and foreign legionaries. In other words, as adventurers. There is no facing of the facts about working-class life, or, indeed, about working life of any description. Very occasionally, one may come across a realistic description of, say, work in a coal mine, but, in all probability, it will only be there as the background of some lurid adventure. In any case, the central character is not likely to be a coal miner. Nearly all the time, the boy who reads these papers, in 9 cases out of 10, a boy who is going to spend his life working in a shop, in a factory, or in some subordinate job in an office, is led to identify with people in positions of command, above all, with people who are never troubled by shortage of money. The Lord Peter Wimsey figure, the seeming idiot who drawls and wears a monocle, but is always to the fore in moments of danger, turns up over and over again. This character is a great favorite in Secret Service stories, and, as usual, the heroic characters all have to talk BBC. They may talk Scottish or Irish or American, but no one in a star part is ever permitted to drop an H. Here, it is worth comparing the social atmosphere of the boys' weeklies with that of the women's weeklies, the Oracle, the Family Star, Pig's Paper, etc. The women's papers are aimed at an older public and are read for the most part by girls who are working for a living. Consequently, they are, on the surface, much more realistic. It is taken for granted, for example, that nearly everyone has to live in a big town and work at a more or less dull job. Sex, so far from being taboo, is the subject. The short, complete stories, the special features of these papers, are generally of the came the dawn type. The heroine narrowly escapes losing her boy to a designing rival, or the boy loses his job and has to postpone marriage, but presently gets a better job. The Changeling Fantasy, a girl brought up in a poor home is really the child of rich parents, is another favorite. Where sensationalism comes in, usually in the serials, it arises out of the more domestic type of crime, such as bigamy, forgery, or sometimes murder. No Martians, death rays, or international anarchist gangs. These papers are at any rate aiming at credibility, and they have a link with real life in their correspondence columns, where genuine problems are being discussed. Ruby M. Ayres' collection of advice in the Oracle, for instance, is extremely sensible and well written. And yet the world of the Oracle and Peg's paper is a pure fantasy world. It is the same fantasy all the time, pretending to be richer than you are. The chief impression that one carries away from almost every story in these papers is of a frightful, overwhelming refinement. Ostensibly, the characters are working-class people, but their habits, the interiors of their houses, their clothes, their outlook, and, above all, their speech are entirely middle class. They are all living at several pounds a week above their income. And, needless to say, that is just the impression that is intended. The idea is to give the bored factory girl or worn-out mother of 5 a dream life in which she pictures herself, not actually as a duchess, that convention has gone out, but as, say, the wife of a bank manager. Not only is a £5 to £6 a week standard of life set up as the ideal, but it is tacitly assumed that that is how working-class people really do live. The major facts are simply not faced. It is admitted, for instance, that people sometimes lose their jobs. But then the dark clouds roll away, and they get better jobs instead. No mention of unemployment as something permanent and inevitable. No mention of the dole. No mention of trade unionism. No suggestion anywhere that there can be anything wrong with the system as a system. There are only individual misfortunes, which are generally due to somebody's wickedness, and can, in any case, be put right in the last chapter. Always the dark clouds roll away. The kind employer raises Alfred's wages, and there are jobs for everybody, except the drunks. It is still the world of the wizard and the gem, except that there are orange blossoms instead of machine guns. The outlook inculcated by all these papers is that of a rather exceptionally stupid member of the Navy League in the year 1910. Yes, it may be said, but what does it matter? And, in any case, what else do you expect? Of course, no one in his senses would want to turn the so-called Penny Dreadful into a realistic novel or a socialist tract. An adventure story must, of its nature, be more or less remote from real life. But, as I have tried to make clear, the unreality of the wizard and the gem is not so artless as it looks. These papers exist because of a specialized demand, because boys at certain ages find it necessary to read about Martians, death rays, grizzly bears, and gangsters. They get what they are looking for, but they get it wrapped up in the illusions which their future employers think suitable for them. To what extent people draw their ideas from fiction is disputable. Personally, I believe that most people are influenced far more than they would care to admit by novels, serial stories, films, and so forth, and that, from this point of view, the worst books are often the most important, because they are usually the ones that are read earliest in life. It is probable that many people who would consider themselves extremely sophisticated and advanced are actually carrying through life an imaginative background which they acquired in childhood from, for instance, Sapper and Ian Hay. If that is so, the boys' twopenny weeklies are of the deepest importance. Here is the stuff that is read somewhere between the ages of 12 and 18 by a very large population, perhaps an actual majority, of English boys, including many who will never read anything else except newspapers. And, along with it, they are absorbing a set of beliefs which would be regarded as hopelessly out of date in the central office of the Conservative Party. All the better because it is done indirectly. There is being pumped into them the conviction that the major problems of our time do not exist, that there is nothing wrong with laissez-faire capitalism, that foreigners are unimportant comics, and that the British Empire is a sort of charity concern which will last forever. Considering who owns these papers, it is difficult to believe that this is unintentional. Of the 12 papers I have been discussing, i.e., 12 including the Thriller and Detective Weekly, 7 are the property of the Amalgamated Press, which is one of the biggest press companies in the world and controls more than 100 different papers. The Gem and Magnet, therefore, are closely linked up with the Daily Telegraph and the Financial Times. This, in itself, would be enough to rouse certain suspicions, even if it were not obvious that the stories in the boys' weeklies are politically vetted. So it appears that if you feel the need of a fantasy life in which you travel to Mars and fight lions barehanded, and what boy doesn't, you can only have it by delivering yourself over, mentally, to people like Lord Camrose. For there is no competition. Throughout the whole of this run of papers, the differences are negligible, and on this level, no others exist. This raises the question, why is there no such thing as a left-wing boys' paper? At first glance, Such an idea merely makes one slightly sick. It is so horribly easy to imagine what a left-wing boys' paper would be like, if it existed. I remember in 1920 or 1921, some optimistic person handing round communist tracts among a crowd of public school boys. The tract I received was of the question and answer kind. Q. Can a boy communist be a boy scout? Comrade. A. No, comrade. Q. Why, comrade? A. Because, comrade, a boy scout must salute the Union Jack, which is a symbol of tyranny and oppression, etc., etc. Now, suppose that, at this moment, somebody started a left-wing paper deliberately aimed at boys of 12 or 14. I do not suggest that the whole of its contents would be exactly like the tract I have quoted above, but does anyone doubt that they would be something like it? Inevitably, such a paper would either consist of dreary uplift, or it would be under communist influence and given over to adulation of Soviet Russia. In either case, no normal boy would ever look at it. Highbrow literature apart, the whole of the existing left-wing press, insofar as it is at all vigorously left, is one long tract. The one socialist paper in England which could live a week on its merits as a paper is the Daily Herald. And how much socialism is there in the Daily Herald? At this moment, therefore, a paper with a left slant, and at the same time likely to have an appeal to ordinary boys in their teens, is something almost beyond hoping for. But it does not follow that it is impossible. There is no clear reason why every adventure story should necessarily be mixed up with snobbishness and gutter patriotism. For, after all, the stories in the Hotspur and the Modern Boy are not conservative tracts. They are merely adventure stories with a conservative bias. It is fairly easy to imagine the process being reversed. It is possible, for instance, to imagine a paper as thrilling and lively as the Hotspur, but with subject matter and ideology a little more up-to-date. It is even possible, though this raises other difficulties, to imagine a women's paper at the same literary level as the Oracle, dealing in approximately the same kind of story, but taking rather more account of the realities of working-class life. Such things have been done before, though not in England. In the last years of the Spanish monarchy, there was a large output in Spain of left-wing novelettes, some of them evidently of anarchist origin. Unfortunately, at the time when they were appearing, I did not see their social significance, and I lost the collection of them that I had, but no doubt copies would still be procurable. In get-up and style of story, they were very similar to the English fourpenny novelette, except that their inspiration was left. If, for instance, a story described police pursuing anarchists through the mountains, it would be from the point of view of the anarchists and not of the police. An example nearer to hand is the Soviet film Chapayev, which has been shown a number of times in London. Technically, by the standards of the time when it was made, Chapayev is a first-rate film, but mentally, in spite of the unfamiliar Russian background, it is not so very remote from Hollywood. The one thing that lifts it out of the ordinary is the remarkable performance by the actor who takes the part of the white officer, the fat one. A performance which looks very like an inspired piece of gagging. Otherwise, the atmosphere is familiar. All the usual paraphernalia is there. Heroic fight against odds, Escape at the last moment, shots of galloping horses, love interest, comic relief. The film is in fact a fairly ordinary one, except that its tendency is left. In a Hollywood film of the Russian Civil War, the whites would probably be angels and the reds demons. In the Russian version, the reds are angels and the whites demons. That is also a lie, but, taking the long view, it is a less pernicious lie than the other. Here, several different problems present themselves. Their general nature is obvious enough, and I do not want to discuss them. I am merely pointing to the fact that, in England, popular imaginative literature is a field that left-wing thought has never begun to enter. All fiction, from the novels in the mushroom libraries downwards, is censored in the interests of the ruling class. And boys' fiction, above all, the blood and thunder stuff which nearly every boy devours at some time or other, is sodden in the worst illusions of 1910. The fact is only unimportant if one believes that what is read in childhood leaves no impression behind. Lord Camrose and his colleagues evidently believe nothing of the kind, and, after all, Lord Camrose ought to know.